Okay. Hi, Rio. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, my pleasure. I was looking over your bio. I wasn't actually sure who was going to be here today, you or Lauren. And they told me that it was going to be Rio. So happy to have you here. But you and
Yeah,
Lauren worked together on this book called The ABCs of Women's History. Is that right?
that's right. Yeah, I am the author and wrote the words, and Lauren is an illustrator. She has made all the pictures for the book. We worked together on another book called The ABCs of Black History as well. She's a great teammate to have for this project.
How long have you guys worked together?
So far, just the two books, but I guess 5 years now is how long it's taken for both of those books to come into the world. So.
I guess I have to ask, how did you meet each other?
We actually never met before we started working on the ABCs of Black History. Our editor, she put us together. I mean, that's sometimes picture book editors work in that way. So I signed on for the project as a writer, and then my editor found Lauren to do the illustrations for the book. And we worked on the book for a year and a half or more before we met in person when we actually just ran into each other at a bookstore here in Manhattan. So but since then, we've done lots of events and school visits and talks, and we've grown closer.
I've had other people on the show who have done children's books or graphic novels, things like that, and they were the writer of the words. And on several occasions, they just simply found the illustrator online. People
Oh
looking,
wow.
people were advertising, yeah, I'm an illustrator. If you want to work with me, let's hook up, blah, blah, blah. So I wasn't sure what your situation was, but
Yeah, I've heard of that happening where two people go into the project at the jump start. But in my experience, this is my fourth picture book, and in all of my experiences with each publication, the editor has reached out to an illustrator, and we've met that way.
and
That
then
I know that there's lots of ways to do it,
so
lots
they
of ways
kind
to
of
meet.
put you together, yeah.
That's right.
So have you always been writing, or have you had other things that you've done in your life?
I have always been interested in writing, even as a kid, like even I think as early as the third grade, but mostly poetry. I would say that that's my bread and butter. So even the way I think about children's books, I think of as poems also, but for children. But I got an MFA at NYU in poetry, and that's what I studied in college as well. And it's just been part of my life for as long as I can remember. But I am also a parent of a young child, and I do other things and enjoy other things. But as a reader, I would say poetry is my favorite thing to read, and that's definitely what has inspired me to write for a long, long time.
Well, being a parent of a young child is pretty much a full-time job in itself. So
Yeah, I
the
agree.
fact that you can find time to do anything else is very admirable. So this is a children's book, correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's a picture book. Some picture books are for younger kids. I would say that this one, because there's a lot of historical meatiness to it in a way for a picture book. So I would say it's like ages 6 to 12, I would even probably put out there. But I think picture books are really in a way for all ages too. There's a little bit of something for everybody in that format, I think.
Now, when you started working with Lauren, did you have the book essentially written and then she just had to do the illustrations for it? Or did you collaborate on the written part of it as well? In other words, like who selected which women were going to be in it? Or did you already have that
Yeah,
done?
I did that. So I wrote the text, and we did go back and forth as we edited the book. So I wrote the text. It's in rhyming verse, and each page is like kind of thematic in a way. So one page, for example, there are visual artists, women who work in the visual art field. One page might be folks who are athletes, and it's T is for Title IX, for example. And another page might be women who work in science and math, or et cetera. And so I came up with that sort of framework for the book and all the women that I wanted to include in the rhyming verse. And in my first draft, I would make notes saying things like, I can't fit this name in the rhyming verse because there's only so much that a rhyming poem can do. But I'd love if Lauren could illustrate this portrait of this figure. And so my editor would take that to Lauren and they would work out like who can they fit in the illustrations that maybe didn't get to be represented in the text and vice versa. And so through the editing process, we sort of came down to what it is right now. And then there are women who couldn't be fit in the text or the illustrations. And I put a lot of bios in the back matter of the book. So after the story ends, there's lots of like child-friendly biographies, like paragraph-long bios of women that I thought were really important to think about when you're thinking about something like organizing or librarianship. But they just didn't quite make it into the actual story of the book. So
I've had a lot of authors on this show and quite a few poets, and we've had discussions about poetry. And um, I'm going to guess I'm considerably older than you are. And when I grew up, poetry had to rhyme. That was like the rule, right? Okay.
yeah,
At some
me too.
point, they said, no, it doesn't have to rhyme anymore. And there's all sorts of poetry now that's considered poetry that doesn't rhyme.
Yes, yeah.
Um, Given the nature of this book, where you're doing biographical histories of women, why would you choose to rhyme it? Because I would think that would just make it so much more difficult to do biographies of people to rhyme.
I agree. It was really difficult. It's funny because I have a poetry collection, for adults. It's certainly not, I don't rhyme in any of my other poems. But when I wrote the ABCs of Black History, which came out in 2021, there was just something that just seemed to work for me about the rhyming verse. And I actually kind of like it, even though you're right, it is such a bigger challenge actually to rhyme this kind of a nonfiction book. But it made it feel more accessible to me for children because we're talking about, I mean, there's some things that are hugely challenging concepts in this time period, but for the age of reader that I wanted to introduce them to, it felt like rhyming verse was like it's just like a softer, gentler way to talk about some of these big ideas and big moments in history. And so that's why I felt like up to the challenge for it. But it's so funny that you say that because I have never written rhyming poetry besides these two books, ABCs of Women's History and Black History. So it was a personal challenge for me too, but I hope that what you get from it is just sort of more accessibility for children.
Well, when I think of children's books that rhymed, and I go back to my childhood, which was, 125 years ago, I think of like The Cat in the Hat or
Sure.
something like
Right.
that, which is easy enough to rhyme.
Yeah.
The cat, the hat, the bat, sat. But when you're talking about, real people, I think that would be daunting. Well, congratulations for getting through all of that. How did you decide who was going to be in the book?
That's the biggest challenge, I think, because you don't want to leave anyone out who is hugely important. But I think I started there are some names I feel like a lot of us get to learn about when we're thinking about women's history. For example, in the suffrage movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, maybe. But I also, my identity as a Black woman, I really thought it was important to include other people that we maybe don't think about, for example, in the movement for women's suffrage. So there's Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker in that page about voting rights. And so luckily I had that back matter so that if I forgot anybody towards the end of my revisions, I could put them in the back matter. But it was very difficult, I think. And at a certain point, I think I just accepted the fact that you can't fit every single woman into this fiction book. And so what I hope is just like a primer for people who are reading it, to like a jumping off point for them to get started on their own journey into women's history. It doesn't have to check every single box, but I think it's a really inclusive history, and there will be names that you're hopefully really familiar with already, and then hopefully people that you'll encounter that you've never heard of that you're super curious about. You want to learn more.
Well, the names that came to my head while you were talking were Rosa Parks,
Hmm.
Marian Anderson,
Hmm.
and even Eleanor Roosevelt, who was
Yeah.
a real champion of women's rights back in those days.
Rosa Parks and Marian Anderson are both in the book. I don't have Eleanor Roosevelt, but that's again maybe something that will keep
Well,
me up at night.
she wasn't a black woman. That's the only, you
Well,
know,
there's lots of, there's women's of all
all
kinds of
colors in
cultures.
there. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's Asian American women, Indigenous women. There are, there are white women in the book. So it's particularly American. It's mostly, I would say, American women.
I did see
Yeah.
one name on there, Katherine Johnson.
Sure. Yeah.
She was at, you said you had the book there. Can you hold it up to her?
Yeah. I think
Because
she's
that was an excellent story, and it was a great movie. Did you see the movie?
the Hidden Figures
Hidden
movie.
Figures? Yeah.
I did. Yeah, I love that movie. Sorry, let me see if I can find it. It's in a spread with other women in science and math.
She just
Oh, here we
died
go.
too, like a year or so, a couple years ago, right?
Yeah, she lived a really long
Yeah, she
life,
was
which
like, she
is
was old. She was in her 90s, I
pretty
think.
amazing.
Yeah.
She's in her 90s. But yeah, there's Katherine Johnson on this page, and Virginia Apgar is on this spread, and she created the Apgar score, which is, the rubric by which we measure all newborn babies when they're born to check them for jaundice. So it's like a life-saving measure that I feel like I don't really hear a lot about her, so it's fun for me to include her. And then also Ada Lovelace, one of the first computer programmers, who's also a woman. So it was a cool spread to be able to include all those women in STEM.
How far back in history do you go?
That's a great question. I think the earliest I'd go is probably the suffrage movement in the mid 1860s. That's, yeah, up to today.
Did the mid 1860s, the suffrage movement started that long ago?
No, no, but some of these women were born around that
Oh,
time.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So I think well, there's Harriet Tubman is in this,
Okay. Well, she
but
was certainly around then. Yeah.
yeah, I would say like the last 200 years.
Okay. So American history of the
Yeah,
women,
American
right?
history. There's a couple of folks like Greta Thunberg. A lot of people might know who she is, but I wanted to include some people who I consider to be part of living history. And Greta Thunberg's not American, obviously. So there's a couple of outliers, but it's mostly American history in the last 150 to 200 years.
What age group would you say this book is most appropriate for?
I think it's probably going to be most resonant for first through fourth graders.
Has the book been released?
It did. It was released last month. Um, a little bit ahead of Women's History Month, but now I think it's the time when people are really coming to it in March, because it's a time when people are really thinking about and making space to learn about women's history.
Are you planning on doing another book?
Yeah, I have a book that's out this August in late summer. It's very different. It's fiction, picture book, but it's called The Blue Velvet Chair, and it's about a young child who observes the world's changes from a chair in their living room, looking out the window here in New York City.
I think a lot of people are doing that, except they're watching it on television. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little better. It's about changing seasons, the way that we change, but it's for much younger readers. I would say probably more like three to nine.
All right. Well, Rio, I think we're going to wind it down on that. So the book again is called The ABCs of Women's History. It is available. It is written by Rio Cortez and illustrated by Lauren Semmer.
That's right.
Okay. Last
Great.
question is, do you have a website you want to give out?
Sure, yeah. I can be found at riocortez.com.
Okay, super. Well, thank you for coming on the show. It was nice meeting you and chatting with you. Best of luck with your work. Hope it goes well.
Thank you so much. Great meeting you.